If you'd like, you can get out your Bible and be heading to heading back to Second Chronicles, the place of our series. And I actually would encourage you to go there. We're going low tech tonight. I don't have slides with the scriptures on them, so if you do have a Bible or a Bible on your phone, I would encourage you to follow along with us tonight. So there's an old country song that I think you're bound to remember. It was originally sung by someone named Keith Whitley, but it's since been covered by several other country singers too. And there's a line in the middle of the song, in the chorus, that becomes the title of the song. And it goes, "You say it best when," do y'all know the rest of this? There it is. Okay, when you say nothing at all. It's interesting how sometimes that is remarkably true. Sometimes the most memorable and the most powerful impressions that are made on us are made without words ever being spoken, or whenever somebody could have said something and yet expresses themselves another way instead. And that song is a nice little song. It's kind of a romantic song, but there are all kinds of examples of when this could be true. You may realize this yourself if you ever, growing up, got in really big trouble at school, and your parents are picking you up from school. You're expecting the lengthy lecture or some other punishment to come down swiftly from on high just the second you click that seatbelt in the car. But instead what you get is quiet. Too quiet. You know that sound, right? And your mom or dad may not be saying anything, but that silence certainly is. Coaches have this power too, and I can distinctly remember one basketball game had gone so terribly. Not only did our team play really poorly, but we were fighting with each other, and there were a couple of the teammates who were shouting at each other on the court. At one point, one of my teammates actually just got up and left the gym in the third quarter. And we were all just bracing ourselves after the game for the storm that would come when our coach arrived in the locker room. And at that point, we're kind of hoping he'll just let us have it and be done with it. And he walks into the locker room, gathers up his things, and the only thing he says is, "Saturday morning's practice will start an hour earlier." That's all he said. He didn't have to say anything else. It had a powerful impression on us without even really saying a word. Life is filled with kind of examples like that. Probably the strongest ones, the most memorable ones, are for those times when we're down and out. Maybe you're grieving or just plain disappointed. Somebody you love wordlessly takes a seat by your side or wraps you up in a hug. And those are the things that really make an impression on us. They may not say a single thing out loud, but an action like that speaks volumes. Now, there's a reason I'm going down this train of thought tonight, and it has to do, as you might expect, with Second Chronicles. So we started this series not too long ago, and we've made our way to chapter 7 of the book. That's where we're going to be tonight as well, in chapter 7. This chapter has so many things to say in its own right. And there's a really important lesson spelled out in this chapter for the life of faith. I think you can actually sum up the lesson of this chapter in a single word. And I'll share that with you in just a moment. But later, I'm going to draw your attention as well to something else about this chapter that I find incredibly curious. Something really, really strange. And it's not what Second Chronicles says. It's what it does not say. It's something that this chapter leaves unsaid. In fact, the whole book leaves it unsaid. And I almost wonder if the thing that this chapter in Second Chronicles might say the loudest is the thing that it doesn't say at all. So let's go ahead and pick up there in that chapter. When we last left off, there was a temple dedication happening. And you may remember, if you were here last week, that it was just a marvelous event. I mean, the temple itself is spectacular. There's gold gleaming in many places. There's the big procession of people gathering from far and wide to come to the great dedication of the temple. There were trumpets blasting. There were people shouting and people singing. You remember at the end of chapter 6, how the glory of the Lord fills the temple itself, and it's like a cloud in the temple, and the priests can't even stand to be in there. And then Solomon, for his part, he gives that really lengthy prayer to the Lord, which turns out to be kind of like a roadmap of Israel's future. And he kept listing out all those different scenarios and bringing them to the Lord and saying, when this happens, and we turn away from you in this very specific way, but then we turn back to you again, will you hear us, Lord? Will you forgive us? And the last thing we saw when we left off last time was in verse 2 of chapter 7. And this is where God, in a way, gives his answer to Solomon's prayer in this really dramatic way. You might recall the fire came down from heaven, like something you would remember from Elijah's story. Fire comes down from heaven and consumes the offerings, as if God is saying his resounding yes to Solomon's prayer. Yes, I will hear you when you pray to me. In all circumstances. Yes, I will forgive you when you return to me with all of your heart and soul. So that's where we stopped. God's dramatic fire from heaven answer to Solomon's prayer. And from that point forward in chapter 7, from verse 2 down to verse 11, the next several verses tell us that the temple dedication went on. Actually, this whole temple dedication strings out into like a 7-day festival. And at the end of it all, everybody's so joyful. They're joyful to have seen the goodness of the Lord, this chapter says, shown to David and to Solomon and to his people Israel. And then everybody starts to go home. Looks like it's over. Not so fast. Because while everybody else goes home, the Lord has one more thing to say to Solomon before we move on from the temple day and that prayer that Solomon offered. So let's pick up and read beginning in verse 12, 2 Chronicles 7, verse 12. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon in the night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. So you see how what God is talking about here is exactly what has just transpired at the temple. He says, I heard your prayer, the prayer you just prayed, and I want you to know, I do choose this place, the temple. It is my house. And then he's going to say something else that pertains to what we saw last time. Verse 13, when I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves, pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. And if you were listening last week, that ought to sound very familiar, because over and over and over again, that's exactly what Solomon was asking for. The Lord basically repeats exactly what Solomon prayed, and then says, I will do exactly as you prayed. I will do this for you. Verse 15, my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayer that is made in this place. For now I have chosen and consecrated this house so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And I, from the perspective I read this from, can hardly resist seeing how that promise there has an ongoing fulfillment for us as we are God's temple here today. My eyes and my heart will be there But that's kind of a subject for another time. So the Lord's going to turn to another subject here too. Up to now, he's been talking about the dedication of the temple, that prayer that Solomon prayed, the house that he's built. Now he's going to talk about Solomon himself. And it's in this part that our important takeaways for tonight really come out. So now turning to Solomon, the Lord says, verse 17, "As for you, if you walk before me, as your father David walked, doing according to all that I have commanded you and keeping my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish your royal throne as I made a covenant for your father David, saying, you shall never lack a successor to rule over Israel. But if you turn aside and forsake my statutes and my commandments that I've set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will pluck you up from the land that I've given you, and this house, which I have consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight and will make it a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And regarding this house now exalted, everyone passing by will be astonished and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this house? Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they embraced other gods and worshipped them and served them. Therefore, he has brought all this calamity upon them." This is what the Lord says to Solomon. And I think that there's a pretty powerful lesson in that message for all of us here tonight, too. So God's speech to Solomon lays out a principle that's not just for Solomon, but for followers of the Lord in all places and in all times. And it's a lesson, like so many of the lessons we have encountered and will encounter in this book, it's a lesson about allegiance and about choice. I think it can be summed up in a single word. I mentioned this earlier. And that word is the word if. The message spoken by God to Solomon in this passage is if. And it's one that continues to speak to us. If you walk before me as your father David walked, doing all that I've commanded you and keeping my statutes and my ordinances, then things are going to go really well in these following ways. But if you turn aside and forsake my statutes and my commandments that I've set before you and go and serve other gods and worship them, then things are not going to go so well in all of these different ways. It lays out these two very different outcomes, and everything hinges on that little word, if. Maybe the lesson for us tonight is that we ought to take that little word seriously as well. To me, the speech that Solomon gives here is not so different from another one we find in the Old Testament, and that is in Deuteronomy chapter 30. Might be worth flipping over to that passage too. Deuteronomy chapter 30. So here God is going to speak through Moses. And just like in 2 Chronicles 7, sort of lays out two pathways for how these things can go, lays it out for the wandering Israelites who have just arrived at the precipice of the promised land. This is what he says, beginning in verse 11, Deuteronomy 30. Surely this commandment I'm commanding you today is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us, so that we may hear it and observe it. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross to the other side of the sea for us and get it for us, so that we may hear it and observe it. No, the word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. In other words, you have God's commands available to you, but will you choose to do them? Verse 15, see, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you're entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall certainly perish. You shall not live long in the land that you're crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. And I'll just stop at the very start of this next sentence. Choose life. Choose life. That's the lesson that God lays out in Deuteronomy and in 2 Chronicles. Solomon's life, much like Israel's life, much like our own lives, hinges on that little powerful word, if. And that's not to say that if ever we choose wrongly, and certainly we do, that that's just that and the end of it for us. You remember, God just got finished confirming the very words of Solomon's prayer. And he kept on saying, when things go wrong in this way or that way or this way or that way, will you hear us and forgive us if we turn to you? And God says, yes, I will. I will forgive you. I will hear you when you return to me with your heart. So it's not as though if we ever mess up, that's just that. But chapter 7 of 2 Chronicles focuses on that matter of our choice, to walk in God's ways or not, to maintain our allegiance to the true God or to serve other gods, whatever it is that may promise to give what only God can give. What will we choose? The message is, choose the good one. Choose life. See to it that you're choosing that path at all the little forks in the road that make you decide if you're going to follow him or you're not. That's really the lesson of 2 Chronicles 7. It's what will you do with that word if in your life? It's a lesson that's really spoken loud and clear. And we get a lot out of it if we took it to heart and live by it. There's one more thing, though, about this chapter I want us to consider. So we've looked at what 2 Chronicles 7 says with that big word if. But as we wrap up tonight, I want to draw attention to something that 2 Chronicles never says. And I find this really fascinating. So the title of our series here, History Worth Repeating. And in the first lesson, we set out to set the stage for how Chronicles as a book is looking back on this history that happened long ago, long before the book was actually written down. It's looking back on the days before the exile and trying to tell that story for a new time and a new place. And we actually talked also about how very often in 2 Chronicles it mentions the fact that these stories have been told before. 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, they cover a lot of this ground. Chronicles is always reminding us at the end of each story of a different king. Now, the words that have been written about these kings, are they not also written here and here and here and here? Because people knew these stories. They've been told before. So Chronicles is retelling these stories for a purpose. It has a lot to do with that word if. Like, let's repeat the good things and go down that path. Let's not repeat and be doomed to repeat bad history. We don't want to do that stuff anymore. So here's the thing I find interesting. Here's the thing that never gets said in Chronicles. So if you got your Bible open to 2 Chronicles 7, look one more time at what God says to Solomon. It started in verse 17. It went to the end of the chapter. Take a look at the two ways that God says this can go. Solomon can do a few things. What are they? Walk in the ways of his father David. Keep the Lord's commandments, statutes, ordinances, maintain his allegiance to the Lord, essentially, and things will go well. Or Solomon can do a few other things: forsake God's commandments, serve other gods and worship them. Things are not going to go well if he chooses to do those things. Now, some of you know the story of Solomon. Which way does he go? Which path does his life go down? If we weren't in the auditorium tonight, we were in a small classroom and I had a whiteboard or something like that, I might ask you to tell me the things you know about Solomon. Just tell me what you know about Solomon. I have an idea of some of the things you might say. You might say something about how Solomon's very wise, right? We talked about how when he could have asked for anything, he asked for wisdom. And the Lord gave him that wisdom. Someone might talk about how Solomon is very rich, very wealthy. He had all this money and all this stuff because the Lord gave him more than just wisdom, but all this other stuff too. And he has an incredible amount of things. If you know the story of Solomon, it might be one of the things you know about him. Somebody might say something about how he built the temple. It's kind of the high watermark for Solomon. It's this big, huge moment. We just saw how great it was. Someone might say something else about how Solomon had an unthinkable number of wives and concubines. For you and me, that's probably something that we always remember about Solomon. He had how many wives? How many birthdays to remember did he really have? 1 Kings tells us he had 700 and 300 wives and concubines. Probably something that sticks in our minds if you know the story of Solomon. And if you read 1 Kings, all tied up in that detail is the pathway that Solomon ends up choosing for his life. This is 1 Kings 11 in verse 4. It says, when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Now, what does that remind you of? Aren't those all of the very same things that God listed when he told Solomon in 2 Chronicles 7 about the ways his path could go? He could choose to follow his father David. He could choose these other gods. And 1 Kings is telling us that at a certain point, Solomon chose the other way and these other gods. He did not follow his father David. He didn't maintain his allegiance to the Lord. And all of these things lead, if you continue down 1 Kings chapter 11, these things lead to a disastrous conclusion. God tears the kingdom in half. It is a divided kingdom from that point forward. He does it in the lives of Solomon's children, but 1 Kings 11 says he does it because of this. This is what Solomon chose, and so this is what happened. So if you know the story of Solomon, you may know this about him. You know the way this ends. Do you know that Chronicles doesn't tell us any of that? Chronicles goes on for 2 more chapters about Solomon. It devotes 9 chapters in total to Solomon, more than any other king by far in the whole book. Not a word is said about the 700 wives. Not a word is said about turning to other gods. Not a word is said about how Solomon's departure from the ways of his father David will ultimately lead to the divided kingdom. A whole lot is said about that divided kingdom, but it never ever ties it back or mentions Solomon in all of that. All of these things about Solomon are unspoken in Chronicles. My guess, they didn't have to be. The effect of this word of warning, like that quiet ride home in the car with your parents when you're in trouble, or the coach who just quietly gathers his things and says, practice is starting early tomorrow. The effect of this word of warning is made all the stronger by what the book never says, but everybody already knows. It doesn't have to say it. The story of Solomon is so well known. And all that people needed to do was read this warning. If your life, Solomon, goes down this pathway, this is what you can expect. All they needed was a little faint echo, a whisper of where these things were going to get the whole effect on their lives. None of the rest needed to be stated. Maybe the most powerful thing about Chronicles is when it says nothing at all. And I'm reminded that God has a way of doing that. God has a way of speaking volumes with hardly an audible word. The Lord brought Elijah to his knees with the sound of a gentle whisper. And he made the disciples say about Jesus, "Who is this?" in the calm right after a storm. The centurion knew that he had seen the Son of God when Jesus breathed his last. And the prodigal son knew that he was forgiven and home again. Not when it was said in so many words, but when the Father wrapped him up in his embrace. Many things in this life do not need to be spoken to be heard. And the point of any sermon is not that you would hear what I say, but that God might somehow speak what you need to hear in some quiet chamber of your heart. So, really, the more important question is, how is God speaking to us tonight? And what does he need to say? It could be something that has very much to do with what we discussed with Solomon tonight. It could be something else altogether. But as I think about the things left unsaid in Chronicles, it reminds me to think about and encourage all of you to make room for the Lord to speak to our hearts in our lives, even in those ways where no actual word needs to be spoken. So I would encourage you to listen to the voice of the Lord in your life in a way that helps you choose life and answer that word "if" with full allegiance to the Lord. Let's consider that as we give this invitation to respond while we stand, while we sing.